What if I told you that one of the most powerful kings in European history, ruler of an empire so vast it stretched across continents, was so physically and mentally deformed that his own people believed he was possessed by demons? His name was Charles II of Spain, and to his subjects he wasn't just a monarch, he was a living curse. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. His face was distorted by a monstrous jaw, his speech a garbled murmur, and his body so broken it defied explanation. He couldn't walk properly, couldn't speak clearly, couldn't even eat without help, and most tragically of all, he couldn't produce an heir. But the truth behind Charles's condition wasn't supernatural. It wasn't witchcraft or divine punishment, it was genetics. Charles was the final product of centuries of inbreeding, a part of the infamous Habsburg dynasty's obsession with keeping power in the family. For generations, they married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, believing they were preserving royal blood. Instead, they were unraveling their own genetic code. This is the haunting true story of a king whose body was a battleground of broken DNA, a man so medically compromised that his autopsy shocked even the most hardened physicians. This is the tragedy of a monarch whose death didn't just end a dynasty, it ignited a war that consumed half of Europe. Forget what you think you know about royal history. This isn't a tale of crowns and conquests. This is a slow-motion collapse, told through twisted bone and failing flesh. This is the tragedy of Charles II, the king destroyed by his own bloodline. When foreign envoys arrived at the Spanish court, expecting to meet the ruler of a global empire, they were met with a shock they couldn't conceal. Charles II, King of Spain, ruler of territories stretching across the world, couldn't even close his own mouth. His jaw jutted forward so grotesquely that his lips couldn't meet. His mouth hung open at rest, like a door ripped off its hinges. And this wasn't some tragic birth defect. It was the price of 200 years of incestuous ambition. You see, the Habsburgs believed in keeping the bloodline pure, but in practice that meant they turned marriage into a family reunion. Cousins married cousins, and uncles married nieces. The family tree didn't branch, it curled in on itself, like a snake eating its own tail. Charles's parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also uncle and niece on both sides. By the time Charles was born, his gene pool had shrunk to the size of a muddy puddle. Medically, he had less diversity than someone from a centuries-isolated island tribe, and it showed. His most iconic feature was what doctors now call mandibular prognathism, but everyone else simply called it the Habsburg jaw. Charles's lower jaw didn't just protrude, it dominated his face. His top and bottom teeth didn't meet at all. You could slide a coin through the gap when his mouth was closed. Chewing was a fantasy, even talking was a struggle. Eating for Charles wasn't a royal ritual, it was a humiliation. Every meal had to be specially prepared into mush, as if he were an infant. Meats were minced, bread soaked until it dissolved, and everything pureed until it resembled baby food. And even then, it didn't guarantee success. Palace staff were assigned to discreetly wipe saliva from his chin. Soup dribbled constantly. Solid bits spilled out like crumbs from a broken puppet. Dinners meant to display royal grandeur became grotesque performances, with courtiers trying not to wince as their monarch slurped and drooled before them. His speech was nearly incomprehensible. His jaw deformity didn't just affect eating, it mangled language itself. Words came out wet and slurred like a mouthful of pebbles. Foreign diplomats required translators not for Spanish, but for Charles's Spanish. Even his mother, Queen Mariana, wrote privately of her terror that Charles might choke in his sleep, fearing his oversized tongue and distorted throat would betray him in the night. Imagine that. The King of Spain, once the ruler of the New World, reduced to a choking hazard. And the worst part? The Habsburgs knew this was happening. They saw the deformities getting worse with each generation. But power was more sacred than health, more sacred than their own children. Charles wasn't a fluke. He was a warning they ignored. And the jaw was just the beginning. Charles II's entire body was a masterclass in what happens when genetics go catastrophically wrong. At 35 years old, he looked like a sickly child, twisted and stretched like wax melting in the sun. He stood barely 5 feet tall, but it wasn't just about height. It was his proportions. grotesquely out of sync. His head was massive, too large for his thin, skeletal frame, and it bobbed weakly atop a neck that seemed too frail to hold it. His limbs were stick-like, bony, almost translucent. His torso was compressed as if someone had tried to squash him into the mold of a human being but failed. He didn't walk until he was 8. While toddlers stumble into their first steps before age 2, Charles spent almost a decade on the floor, too weak to support his own weight. Even after learning to walk, it wasn't walking, it was stumbling. A slow, uneven shuffle from one piece of furniture to another. He moved like an old man, not a prince in his prime. His spine was severely curved, permanently hunched. His silhouette looked like someone physically burdened, and in a way, he was. He carried the weight of centuries of genetic roulette. Mentally, the damage was just as tragic. Charles had the mind of a child well into his adulthood. He didn't learn to read until he was 10, and even then, it didn't stick. Court tutors described teaching him as like pouring water into a cracked jug. It went in, but nothing stayed. Emotionally, he was just as unstable. He'd throw tantrums over minor frustrations, screaming, flailing, and sobbing uncontrollably. Then came the silence. Hours spent staring into space, unresponsive, as if his mind had simply checked out. Even his hair told the story. It came in thin, brittle patches, constantly falling out. His scalp was blotchy and inflamed, more beast than royal. Official painters were instructed to beautify him, using clever angles, soft lighting, and selective imagination. But even the best artist couldn't mask the truth. And here's the most terrifying part. Charles wasn't born with all these issues. He got worse with age. Most people stabilize in their teens or 20s. Charles deteriorated. His body broke down faster than doctors could understand. It was as if nature itself was trying to reclaim him. But medicine had no answers, so the court began looking elsewhere. And that's where things got truly disturbing. Charles II wasn't just a tragic figure. He was a royal disaster waiting to happen. In the grand game of monarchy, there's one duty above all else: produce an heir. But Charles couldn't. Despite being the most powerful man in Europe, at least on paper, he was physically incapable of fulfilling the most basic requirement of kingship. He was married twice, and both unions ended the same way, in heartbreak, scandal, and total failure. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, was a French princess, young, lively, and educated. She was raised to expect power, prestige, and at the very least, a functional husband. But when she arrived in Madrid, she found herself married to a man who looked and acted like a fragile child in a king's robes. The wedding night was a catastrophe. It is reported that Marie-Louise emerged from the royal bedchamber in tears. Charles looked confused, distraught, perhaps even unaware of what was expected of him. Behind closed doors, royal physicians made a devastating discovery. Charles's reproductive organs were severely underdeveloped, described in the medical notes of the time as infantile. In modern terms, he had the sexual development of a prepubescent boy trapped in a malformed adult body. The Spanish court couldn't admit this, not publicly. The official narrative was that Marie-Louise was barren, and so began a years-long campaign of blame and humiliation. She was subjected to endless medical examinations, painful, invasive, and degrading. Herbal tonics, bloodletting, superstitious fertility rituals. Some concoctions were so vile they induced vomiting and hallucinations. But no pregnancy ever came, because the problem was never her. It was Charles. The psychological toll on Marie-Louise was immense. Once known for her sharp wit and cheerful disposition, she became quiet, withdrawn, and deeply depressed. When she died suddenly at just 26, rumors exploded. Was it illness, a broken heart, or had she been slowly poisoned by the very fertility cures forced upon her? In a last-ditch effort, Charles remarried. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a family known for fertility. But Charles's condition had deteriorated further, and this marriage too would be barren. Europe, meanwhile, was watching. Everyone knew that without an heir, the Spanish throne would become the biggest prize in European politics. France, Austria, England. They all had claims, and they were preparing to enforce them with armies. Diplomats called it succession planning, but it was vultures circling a dying empire. The Habsburgs had spent centuries orchestrating marriages to keep power in the family, but that very obsession had bred them into extinction. When science failed, the Spanish court turned to something far older, the church, and not just for prayer, for exorcism. By the end of Charles's life, royal physicians had been replaced by priests, and the throne room itself had become the stage for full-blown demonic expulsions. In the minds of many, there was only one explanation left. Charles was possessed. The court's leading exorcist claimed that Charles housed dozens of demons, that witches had cursed him in the womb. And so the rituals began, not in secret, but as public events conducted in the royal palace. Imagine it, the King of Spain, writhing on the cold stone floor while robed priests circled him, chanting Latin invocations and splashing him with holy water. Crosses were pressed against his chest until he screamed. Crosses were ground into powder and mixed into his drinking water, which he'd swallow, then promptly vomit violently. To the priests, that was proof the demons were reacting. Each time he collapsed, they claimed another demon had been expelled. By 1699, one priest claimed they had identified and exorcised 47 demons, each supposedly responsible for a different symptom. In his desperation, Charles believed it was working. The rituals gave him something medicine never could: hope. But that hope came at a price. The exorcisms left him physically exhausted and bedridden, pushing his already weakened body to the edge. The Spanish court was less a government than a desperate asylum where royal power had given way to medieval superstition. On November 1st, 1700, the bewitched king finally died. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, passed away at the age of 38. No heir, no legacy, just whispers, rumors, and a broken empire. But even in death, Charles's body held one final secret. Royal physicians conducted an autopsy, hoping to put the rumors of demons to rest. Instead, they unleashed something far worse. The report, penned by Dr. Geronimo de la Fuente Pierola, was so shocking it was immediately suppressed, but the details eventually leaked. According to the report, Charles's heart was shriveled, blackened, and no larger than a walnut. His lungs were decayed and filled with gangrene, rotting from within. His intestines were described as putrefied, and his stomach was full of fluid and bile. His reproductive organs were catastrophically underdeveloped, confirming he had been biologically incapable of reproduction. But the final discovery was the most chilling. When physicians opened his skull, they found it filled with an abnormal amount of fluid, a condition we now know as hydrocephalus. His brain tissue was discolored and partially deteriorated. Dr. Pierola concluded with a line that echoed through every royal court in Europe. "It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long, as it contained not a single sound organ." The findings didn't dispel the myths, they fed them. How could a man so internally corrupted even function? To the superstitious, it was proof he had been touched by something beyond this world. But there was no magic at work, only biology. When Charles died, the Spanish Empire was leaderless. What followed was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 18th century, the War of the Spanish Succession. It dragged on for 13 years, drew in nearly every major European nation, and killed hundreds of thousands. All because one man, broken from birth, couldn't fulfill the one duty he was born for. It was the final, violent exclamation mark on a dynasty that believed genetic purity meant divine right. Instead, it produced Charles II. The most powerful family in Europe had bred itself into biological extinction. Today, Charles II is often remembered as a footnote, a strange, almost pitiful king whose reign collapsed into failure. But look closer, and you'll see something far more haunting. He wasn't just a bad king. He was a biological warning, a symbol of what happens when human ambition overrides human limits. The Habsburgs saw the warning signs. Each generation grew sicker, more fragile, more malformed. But instead of changing course, they doubled down. They lied, covered it up, called it witchcraft, blamed their wives, and hired priests. In the end, biology doesn't care about politics. It doesn't care about thrones, titles, or divine rights. It just breaks, quietly and fatally. And when it did, it took a dynasty and half of Europe with it. So the next time you hear someone romanticize royal bloodlines or dream of being born into power, remember Charles II, the king with no heir, no healthy organ, and no chance from the very beginning. A king who died not from assassination, betrayal, or war, but from being exactly what his family created him to be. If this kind of dark, forgotten history fascinates you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Tell me what royal secrets, strange rulers, or historical mysteries I should uncover next, because the past isn't always what you learned in school. Sometimes, it's far darker.